Hey guys, it's Charlie. Welcome back to my channel. It's been almost a year, I think, since I've made a video on YouTube. I go live regularly on Instagram, and I just recently came back to Facebook as well. This video today, though, is going to be a little bit different because it's not going to be my normal just kind of rambling or off-the-cuff thing. The topic that I would like to discuss today is something that it's very important for me to make sure that I'm not forgetting anything and that I'm saying what I mean to say in the way that I mean to say it. So I'm actually going to be reading the entirety of today's video. As you can tell by the title, it's called The Societal Shadows of Cultural Appropriation, and this is me reading in essence, an essay that I wrote titled the same name, The Societal Shadows of Cultural Appropriation. So a few disclaimers before we get started. To explain why I'm reading, I consider myself to be a stronger writer than speaker. I'm fine with speaking, but my strengths really come through the written word. And in order to make sure that the message that I'm conveying and what I want to say is as clear as I can make it be, I wrote it out instead of just kind of going off the top of my head in the moment. Because like I said, this specific topic is really important for me to make sure that I'm being clear in the way that I want to convey myself. To date, it's quite possible that this is the most important video that I have made. Hopefully in the future I'll have other videos that are just as important, but to date I would say that this is probably one of the most important videos that I've made. The second disclaimer is that I am only speaking from my mixed perspective, both as someone who identifies as an Asian American and as a Japanese person or Jewish Japanese person. I did include some things that I have a bit more perspective on based on the lived experience of some of my close friends, but I didn't include anything extra personal from them, and I also did not include anything from them where I was unsure on the accuracy. So anything that I include that is kind of outside of my own experience, I'm pretty confident on the content that I'm sharing with that based on the conversations and kind of sharing that I have with my friends of color and mixed friends. And finally, I am bound to be wrong on some things. My current perspective on this comes from a lot of deep reflection, spanning several years of very deep, often painful, introspective work and taking meticulous emotional inventory on this. But I am by no means anywhere near an expert. I'm sharing this because I do have thoughts on this from various intersectional perspectives relevant to the content that I'm discussing. Finally, a fourth point that I did not share in either the Facebook Live or Instagram Live that I did on this topic earlier it was last week. I wrote this out on perhaps Wednesday, or I think it was Wednesday of last week, so Wednesday the 11th perhaps, maybe Tuesday the 10th. It was the day after there was an article published in Allure magazine regarding Gwen Stefani, and I wrote this the day after that article was published. So whatever date that was is when this essay was written. So you'll hear me refer to things like, I read an article yesterday. That's yesterday from the standpoint of when I wrote this article, or when I wrote this essay. So not yesterday from this moment in time. I hope I'm making sense. So with all that said, let's get started. After completing my racial identity series on Facebook, I thought it was done. I thought that would be the end of that and I could move forward. And I'm realizing it was just the beginning. To my disappointment, but utter lack of surprise, I read an article in Allure yesterday about Gwen Stefani in which she announced that, quote, My God, I'm Japanese and I didn't know it. I am, you know. End quote. She said this in response to questions from an Asian American writer on her history, Gwen Stefani's history, with cultural appropriation. Gwen Stefani is no stranger to cultural appropriation. She spent part of the 90s wearing a bindi and bantu knots, for crying out loud. She's also had accusations leveled against her of appropriating Latino culture and indigenous culture. Then in the early 2000s, Stefani pulled together an entourage of Japanese and Japanese American women and had them follow her everywhere as though they were some sort of fashion accessory. Actually, remember how Paris Hilton used to, she may still, carry the little chihuahuas around with her as a fashion accessory? It sort of felt like that. She even forbid them to speak English in public. They were known as Harajuku girls, and it was that line of questioning regarding Stefani's era of appropriating, exploiting, and fetishizing Japanese culture that led her to her confusing statement of, quote, I'm Japanese, and her doubling down on the idea that she's simply a, quote, superfan of the culture, and that she loves and respects it, and that anyone who wants to shame her into not sharing something she loves is just looking to be divisive. This attempted justification of having a love or appreciation or respect for a culture is as old as the cultural appropriation discussion in the spiritual space and elsewhere itself. But respecting the culture also means listening to the urges, pleas, and requests of the members of that culture and stopping when asked. The moment that members of a culture are asking one to please stop doing that, or this isn't for you, please don't attempt to enter this space, and one rejects those requests and accuses those cultural members of being divisive or gatekeeping, as Stefani insinuated in her interview, is the moment one ceases being respectful of that culture. The moment one only seeks out voices of color who agree with one's stance or give permission to one is the moment one ceases being respectful of that culture. The moment one asserts that their own sense of entitlement to a culture that isn't theirs is more important than the wishes of the members of that culture itself is the moment that cultural appropriation is taking place. Why is this? It's because cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation has two distinctive markers that are not mutually exclusive. One, commodification, and two, an unequal power relationship. The person or groups who are appropriating the culture can benefit from its commodification of that culture in ways that are harmful to the original culture itself. Examples in Western society are exhausting. There's the Kardashians capitalizing on cultural appropriation of Black culture. Gwen Stefani, of course, has benefited greatly from her commodification of Japanese culture. Ariana Grande seems to wear whatever culture seems trendy at the time and benefits from that commodification. In the community I'm part of, the spiritual, witchcraft, pagan, and New Age communities, cultural appropriation is rampant. In fact, cultural appropriation is so synonymous with our community that it's a recurring topic of discussion in the AAPI and biracial and mixed groups I'm in, with members of Black, Indigenous, and communities of color lamenting about the constant and continuous misrepresentation, disrespect, and appropriation of their and our cultures. Examples of commodification in the witchy and spiritual communities are white people owning hoodoo shops and profiting off practices created out of necessity by those descended from the slave trade, or non-native people selling and profiting off indigenously sacred and endangered species of plants such as white sage or palo santo, or the bloggers who, in an attempt to keep up with social responsibility and appear more inclusive and diverse, write fluff pieces on their blogs with inaccurate or misinterpreted articles or concepts that lack their own cultural and context or integrity, articles which ultimately lead them to a wider readership, audience, or customer base from where they can cash in on money, follows, likes, and shares. Of course, in most cases, harm is not intended. The people who are culturally appropriating typically are not malevolent people. But in the Gwen Stefani Allure article, written by Asian American Jessa Marie Kellor. I hope I'm saying her last name right. She sums it up that, quote, "Words don't have to be hostile in their intent in order to potentially cause harm." It's possible that harm isn't intended, but it doesn't have to be in order to cause harm. That brings us to the next point, which is one that's less tangible and I found often more difficult for my fellow white people to grasp, and that's power. Where commodification is pretty clear-cut, you're either profiting in some way or you're not, and the support has grown among white people against commodification in the cultural appropriation space. The concept of power is far more elusive, and often my fellow white people don't see ourselves as holding power, especially if we're poor or not wealthy, so surely we as individuals must be exempt from this. But we're not. Jessa Marie cites in her Allure article one of the most concise definitions I've read on the unequal power dynamic of cultural appropriation. The co-director of the Asian American Studies program at the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Fariha Khan, explains, when a group has been historically marginalized and or racialized by another group, the issue of power is central to cultural appropriation. The dominant group has the power to take or appropriate the marginalized group's customs and practices and give those traditions meaning without the original context or significance. End quote. That is something that the spiritual and witchy community is abundantly guilty of doing. Abundantly guilty. Take the phrase toxic positivity as an example. The term gained more mainstream popularity 6 or 7 years ago in direct opposition to the unrealistic optimism that often dismissed or invalidated the physical, mental, or emotional suffering of others in the New Age and spiritual realms. As charlatans and grifters attempted to hustle and swindle innocent bystanders of money by selling thought exercises and manifestation courses, a counterculture was born, and railing against toxic positivity was its goal. What isn't as widely considered is that the concept of toxic positivity took on its own toxicity, often branding anything that didn't validate, agree, or align with the misery or the misrepresentation of the shadow self, more on the misrepresentation later, as being toxic positivity. With that, entire Eastern philosophies, such as Buddhism, were dragged into this sort of mindset culture war. The irony, of course, is that both schools of thought, both the school of unrealistic optimism and the counterculture against it, were completely misunderstanding and thus misrepresenting various Eastern philosophies and branding them as toxic, without any self-awareness that they had no idea what they were talking about. As they say, tell me you don't understand Eastern philosophy without telling me. When Buddhism discusses the Four Noble Truths, which focuses largely on an end goal that leads to the end of suffering and is a lifelong practice, often never completely achieved, it isn't asking practitioners to reject suffering from their reality or to deny suffering or pretend it doesn't exist. Yet, if a person in the spiritual community were to hear some of the thought-provoking ideas that arise from philosophical consideration within the Buddhist spaces, they may very likely pass it off as toxic positivity simply because they can't be bothered to surrender to understanding any deeper than a superficial level, that is, to take words at face value. Tossing the label of toxic positivity on some Eastern philosophies as well is to completely misunderstand the differences in the Eastern and Western philosophies entirely, not least of which includes the Eastern perspective that self is an illusion, and the insistence in Western perspective that individual identity exists and we are all separate and independent of one another. I can't speak on Hinduism or Taoism because I don't study or practice them, but knowing the vast differences between the perspectives and philosophies between East and West, for lack of better categorization, I can say with confidence that dismissing any and all tenets that may come from Eastern religions as toxic positivity, either directly or indirectly, speaks more to the Westerner's lack of understanding than it does the toxicity of the Eastern philosophy. So in summary, coolly brushing off any idea that doesn't weigh heavily into the depths of individualism and the emotion one experiences as an individual as toxic positivity is one way that the dominant culture, Western and white, completely changed the meaning and reduced the significance of the marginalized culture. For those who have difficulty following that last bit, which I don't fault you for, it was a little bit heady, a clearer and more materialistic example fit for Westerners is this. If you Google kimono, Theoretically, you should only have one set of results, those of Japanese garments meant for various ceremonies and events. However, if you Google kimono, what you are actually shown as results are open-fronted loungewear in the form of silk robes or house coats, as well as open-fronted patterned shawls meant to be worn as a casual accessory. Those are not kimonos. There are plenty of other ways to describe those garments: open-fronted blouse, robe, shawl, cover-up. Why steal the word kimono? That is an example where the dominant group, non-Japanese and likely white, stole from the marginalized group and then gave what they stole new meaning that lacks original cultural context or significance. When many first-generation Japanese Americans emigrated from Japan, a lot of them left behind many belongings, but of the belongings they did bring, many brought their kimonos, as they are steeped in rich cultural history, meaning, tradition, and symbolism. There are specific grades of kimono and different materials and patterns which hold different meanings. There are particular rules to follow when wearing kimono based on the age of the person wearing the garment as well as the occasion it's being worn to. To have that word stolen carelessly and all meaning and tradition stripped away and used for American commodification feels, to me, distressing. I first came upon this particular example personally in 2018 when a white coworker was telling me how she had just purchased a new kimono. I promptly corrected her. This was also around the time that Kim Kardashian was starting her new Skims line and had originally named it Kimono and eventually changed it because Asian Americans voiced how offensive it was. Or how about this? How about the practices and concepts of things like smudging, or chakra, or spirit animals, or spirit guides, or karma? When you hear any of the aforementioned words, what images were evoked in your mind? The words that I read were smudging, chakra, spirit animal, spirit guide, karma. I bet for many of you, it's images of eclectic witches who you know. Ones who aren't practicing the full, intact traditions from where those concepts are pulled, am I right? Or perhaps some of you even had images evoked of yourself experiencing these things versus images of them in their intact culture and traditions. How many of these words and concepts have had their meanings whitewashed and replaced with a strange and new meaning that lifted them from their original cultures and significance? The answer, unfortunately, is all of them. Look at all the appropriation that goes on at music festivals and how this sort of obsession to things appearing exotic tears certain terms and practices and customs and philosophies away from their original cultures, blends them up, and makes them more easily digestible to people outside of those cultures. In doing that, diminishing their meaning. These are all examples of the dominant group taking from the marginalized groups and repurposing their traditions, customs, and practices, effectively and occasionally nearly entirely removing them from their respective cultures. Over the years, one thing that has sort of repeatedly come up and has been suggested, typically by white people, but sometimes by people of color as well, is this idea that we should be sharing our cultures, and that by withholding this willingness to share, we are ultimately creating division. On one hand, I can see that perspective and its validity. But I also want to offer this additional perspective at the risk of infantilizing this topic. Parents out there, and those who aren't parents, hopefully you have some sort of experience with maybe siblings or nieces or nephews in a similar capacity that you're able to relate to this. It's a pretty simple example to relate to, I think. So parents, we can relate that we often teach our children to share. That's one of the first and earliest lessons that we provide them as we begin introducing them to the very complex experience of existing within a society. We teach them to share. We teach them to share their toys. We teach them to share their treats. We teach them to share their space. We teach them to share. It's a very early lesson. But we also teach our children, or at least I hope we are teaching our children, to ask before taking and to respect the boundaries of others and to understand consent. Right? We are hopefully teaching our children that they don't have to hug anyone that they don't want to hug, and that their consent is important. If the child has a favorite blankie that is their sense of security in an unfamiliar place, like a daycare or a school or another person's home, we wouldn't expect them to hand that item over at the insistence of the child or even the adult that lives or works or is otherwise familiar with that place, right? No. We wouldn't expect them to hand over their literal security blanket. If your child goes up to another child and asks to play with a toy, and that child declines, your guidance to your child wouldn't be to rip it out of the other child's arms, would it? Of course not. Your guidance would be, well, find something else to play with. Maybe your child doesn't want to share their toy with Andy because Andy has been a bully to them, or maybe last time they did share with Andy and Andy broke the fucking toy. You just ruined it. So would you blame your child then for being hesitant to share with Andy in the future? Of course not. Do you expect Andy to respect your child's answer of no, you cannot play with this toy? Of course you do. Of course you expect Andy to respect your child's boundaries. Of course you do. Cultural appropriation, while much more complex than an example of kids on a playground, is really not all that different. It's more complex, but it's not that different. You may be asked not to participate in a practice, or a festival, or a custom. You may be asked not to participate. And you are expected to respect that boundary. You are expected to respect consent. There are also occasions where you may be permitted to engage in certain cultural affairs with an elder or for a particular festival, but that doesn't necessarily give you a free rein pass to practice it all the time or to show others how to practice it, right? An example that I can think of, this is a really good example, is that I have a non-native friend, and she was taught by a Native American elder how to properly engage in the ceremony that we know as smudging. But my friend knows that this is meant for her personal practice in her home and done with reverence. She's not out there writing about it on her blog or advertising it on YouTube or social media in some weird way to gain clout or seem exotic. She's respecting the consent and the boundaries of the elder who taught her, and by extension, she's respecting that tribe's traditions. She's respecting indigenous practices as a whole. So the perspective that we should be sharing our cultures is ultimately aspirational, because before we can get to a point where that is possible on even footing, there is a lot of healing that must take place. Room for the painful generational grievances, traumas, and wounds must first be allowed the space, time, and patience to surface and heal. Selflessly sharing cultures is not something we can force without proper healing, lest we create more wounds unintentionally. And it is up to the wounded to determine when their healing has reached the point of satisfaction, not the oppressors, and not the group of bystanders benefiting from the oppression, myself included in many of those instances. When a child is wounded because they fell off their bike, we don't rush their healing. Well, some parents do, but not the ones who are trying to foster love and trust in their children. Instead, just as we would for a friend or a family member going through any sort of trauma or crisis, we make space and support for that healing without centering ourselves or our own needs or wants. It's the same for these generational wounds. Marginalized communities and cultures are not expected to heal faster because of the impatience of everyone else and because everyone else is eagerly and, dare I say, selfishly waiting for access to what those marginalized communities have. Talk about toxic positivity, by the way. We're talking about, like, hurry up and heal faster. Like, you should be over this by now. It's already been 200 years. Like, why are you still on this? Like, you should just be over it. Just hurry up and get better. You're fine. Just give me access to your culture. Like, if you want to talk about toxic positivity, let's. So now we get to this sort of global shadow of humanity, one of many which exist. I'm sure it's not the only shadow, but it is one global societal shadow of humanity. Lately, the term shadow work has been a buzzword, much to my dismay. Not only is it a buzzword, but it's also been grossly oversimplified and misrepresented. That said, everyone seems to want to participate in it. They're talking about digging into their shadows and healing their shadows, but the irony is that this right here, this cultural appropriation bit that I've been talking about this entire time, is such a deep, massive well ripe with potential for shadow work on a mass scale, global, on both sides, the oppressed and the oppressors. I just mentioned moments ago the space which requires holding for healing, and both the dominant groups and the marginalized groups are beneficiaries of this healing. You guys can't see my hands. Both the dominant groups and the marginalized groups are beneficiaries for this healing. Healing is required on both sides. But people, for some reason, aren't taking advantage of it. Why? Only true solitary reflection for each individual person will help them see what lies in their own heart for that answer for that question. There are certain shadows that are socially acceptable. I'm going to digress here just for a moment. Such as admitting that one feels unlovable. One of my shadows is that I feel unlovable. Or they might be afraid of success. One of my shadows is that I'm afraid of success. I don't feel worthy of success. You know, these sort of socially acceptable shadows that, when uttered publicly, bring some sort of benefit to the person uttering them. They may get public praise for their vulnerability, or they may receive public support and love emotionally. But the person admitting these things, there's some sort of benefit to them from an acceptance standpoint. These are not the type of gory, humiliating, terrifying shadows that young warned could be lingering deep in the folds of the mind, out of conscious awareness. We're willing to face the little dust bunny shadows, right? But it seems that we prefer to stay so blind to the true monster tendencies that we may harbor for reasons that seem obvious only from the outside. In On the Psychology of the Unconscious, there's an excerpt by Jung I've long been fascinated by. It reads, "It is a frightening thought that man also has a shadow side to him, consisting not just of little weaknesses and foibles, but of a positively demonic dynamism. The individual seldom knows anything of this. To him, as an individual, it is incredible that he should ever, in any circumstances, go beyond himself. But let these harmless creatures form a mass, and there emerges a raging monster. And each individual is only one tiny cell in the monster's body, so that, for better or worse, he must accompany it on its bloody rampages, and even assist it to the utmost. Having a dark suspicion of these grim possibilities, man turns a blind eye to the shadow side of human nature. Blindly, he strives against the salutary dogma of original sin, which is yet so prodigiously true. Yes, he even hesitates to admit the conflict of which he is so painfully aware." End quote. I was blissfully unaware of my own personal shadows regarding race until 2020, when I had no choice but to reckon with them. Months of painful realizations and frustrations regarding the denial of my own loved ones followed. Ultimately, that led me to my written Racial Identity series on Facebook, and that series led to the wounds being left so open and fresh that the slightest grazing of a similar wound whispering across it called my attention to it like the sting of a skinned knee. I couldn't ignore it any longer. When I read the article in Allure yesterday, I was so angry that I couldn't finish it all in one go. I felt too provoked, too dismissed by Gwen Stefani's words. While superficially some of my pain was temporarily lessened by jokes being made in my mixed Asian groups about Gweeb the Weeb and how Gwen Stefani walked so Arigato Grande, the last race bender, could run, it was still there, boiling under the surface, threatening to create more pain. As many people of color have expressed, and as the article itself, the Allure article itself reminds us, it's easy for a person who is not Japanese in this case to identify with the culture and love it and want to be part of it even when they haven't had to deal with the hard parts, even when their safety and security isn't threatened. You can replace the word Japanese with any other culture of color as well, because while our experiences aren't identical, many of us have the lived experience to empathize from a place of experience with one another. It's easy to enjoy the benefits of Black culture without having to deal with the drawbacks and traumas of it. It's easy to enjoy the benefits of Indigenous culture or Latino culture or Asian culture without having to deal with the complexities and traumas that come from being all or a part or any of the above. I've been guilty of appropriating the culture of others in the past. The difference between myself and Gwen Stefani at this time, maybe she'll see the light in the future, but at this time, however, is that when my awareness is called to it, I acknowledged it. I unearthed it and cast light upon the shadow instead of burying it deeper under entitlement sentiments and lies. From a personal perspective, I'll say it's equal parts heartbreaking and frustrating to have family members who still carry internalized racism within them. I have one family member I've been trying to explain how being made fun of for being Asian or being called Asian slurs or the Jewish K-word in my life is much, much different than the bullying I received for wearing glasses, for example. For real, I had a family member who was trying to say, kids get bullied all the time. They get bullied for all kinds of stuff. They get bullied for having freckles or having red hair or wearing glasses. I said, hi, I had glasses. I was 4 eyes. But being made fun of for having glasses, being called 4 eyes, didn't have these long-lasting, insidious effects on me that affected my sense of self-worth and my identity. I didn't get physically assaulted for wearing glasses like I did for being a quote-unquote Jap. So it's very different. I've had to explain how the very confusing dynamics of my mixed race and ethnicity have played a role in the deeper and longer-lasting and oftentimes more insidious observable effects, and that in my case, compared to theirs, I also had to do it entirely alone, because my family member had siblings. This is a family member on my Asian side, and they had siblings who were also in school with them at the same time, also getting bullied at the same time. So while it doesn't make it any less shitty, at least they weren't alone. They didn't have to go through it entirely alone. My siblings are half-siblings on the non-Asian side, and I didn't have siblings who looked like me who could commiserate. I also, as I mentioned in my racial identity series on Facebook, lacked the cultural support. I experienced the bullying and racism, but I didn't get to experience the food, the festivals, the music, the art, the traditions that might make it seem at least a little bit worth it. Just a little bit worth it. And so, like that child whose toy was taken without their consent, I defiantly announced to him, I've paid my fucking dues. I want my prize. Meaning, I've gone through the hard shit, and I did it alone. I went through the racism. I went through the fucking physical assault. I went through people spitting on me and whipping wet sand in my face and throwing things at me. I want access to my cultures now. So that is the energy of this work. A reverend and solemn duty that I will also uphold with a fiery defiance and necessary provocation. For those who are able to brave past the dissonance they may feel in their being to make it to the end, it would make sense that this is a signal from your soul and your psyche that, like me, you are ready to begin facing and healing the deep societal shadows that we as a collective are beginning to only finally be made aware of one by one. Thank you for listening.